Hello. Welcome to my channel to anyone who is new, and welcome back to any returning subscribers. I'd like to begin today's video with a brief introduction to one of the most impactful creators of the modern era, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was an Irish poet from the 19th century, best known for works like The Portrait of Dorian Gray and The Importance of Being Earnest. Though most notably, Wilde was one of the key figures behind what was called the Decadence movement, an artistic and literary movement born from rising pessimistic attitudes towards both the progress of liberalism and the stagnation of conservatism. As an alternative to these forces that either want to keep society frozen in our dreary past or blazing full speed towards our bleak future, decadence encouraged people to take full advantage of the fleeting beauty and the momentary pleasures only found here in the present. They fully embraced the motto of "we're here for a good time, not a long time," and splurged their middle-class incomes on elegant desserts, expensive knickknacks, and fancy clothing. Though among the delights that the decadents were known to partake in, one of their most cherished pleasures, gifted to them by the present, was art. An obvious explanation for the decadents' great affinity for art was that the movement was led primarily by creatives, but a more substantive reason for their appreciation for art was that it was a perfect encapsulation of everything they valued: boundless fantasy, aimless self-indulgence, and because all art back then was traditional, a transient beauty that was best enjoyed now because it would slowly wither over time. And because art was such a sacred cow to the decadents, figures like Wilde would often defend the integrity of art as a powerful tool of self-expression and escapism against those who wanted to restrict it. In one of Wilde's most famous works, he wrote,
"A work of art is the unique result of a unique temperament. Its beauty comes from the fact that the author is what he is. It has nothing to do with the fact that the other people want what they want. Indeed, the moment that an artist takes notice of what other people want and tries to supply the demand, he ceases to be an artist and becomes a dull or an amusing craftsman, an honest or a dishonest tradesman. He has no further claim to be considered as an artist. Art is the most intense mode of individualism that the world has known. I am inclined to say that it is the only real mode of individualism that the world has known. Crime, which under certain conditions may seem to have created individualism, must take cognizance of other people and interfere with them. It belongs to the sphere of action. But alone, without any reference to his neighbours, without any interference, the artist can fashion a beautiful thing. And if he does not do it solely for his own pleasure, he is not an artist at all. And it is to be noted that it is the fact that art is this intense form of individualism that makes the public try to exercise over it an authority that is as immoral as it is ridiculous, and as corrupting as it is contemptible. It is not quite their fault. The public has always, and in every age, been badly brought up. They are continually asking art to be popular, to please their want of taste, to flatter their absurd vanity, to tell them what they have been told before, to show them what they ought to be tired of seeing, to amuse them when they feel heavy after eating too much, and to distract their thoughts when they are wearied of their own stupidity. Now, art should never try to be popular. The public should try to make itself artistic.
I really connect with Wilde's sentiment here that the artist should make art to satisfy themselves first and foremost. This is partially the reason why I stopped posting all my art on social media. I started to notice that the drive to get more likes and engagement on my posts was starting to have a clear influence on what I wanted to create. By making art meant for my eyes and no one else's, I began to stop worrying about what an audience might want to see and more on what image I wanted to create. Though there's another equally important idea embedded in this excerpt that I'd like to focus on. In addition to self-satisfaction, the broader objective of a true artist that Wilde lays out here is the role of the jester, a person who questions long-held conventions, mocks irrational traditions, or challenges the intuitions of the moral majority. Whether their vehicle of expression evokes amusement or disgust, the ultimate goal of the artist as the jester should be to inspire the public to think for themselves and challenge authority. But, as Wilde lays out in the quote you just heard, not everyone will be on board with the jester's agenda. While there will be some people who appreciate the jester's eccentricities and recognize their good intentions, there are others who hate thinking, worship authority, or simply fear change, who will view them as an existential threat. Instead of challenging them with something unorthodox, they want the artist to glorify their traditions, fulfill their repetitive fantasies, and entertain them without any of that social commentary nonsense. A bit later in the essay, Wilde writes,
"The one thing that the public dislike is novelty. Any attempt to extend the subject matter of art is extremely distasteful to the public, and yet the vitality and progress of art depend in a large measure on the continual extension of subject matter. The public dislike novelty because they are afraid of it. It represents to them a mode of individualism, an assertion on the part of the artist that he selects his own subject and treats it as he chooses. The public are quite right in their attitude. Art is individualism, and individualism is a disturbing and disintegrating force. Therein lies its immense value, for what it seeks to disturb is monotony of type, slavery of custom, tyranny of habit, and the reduction of man to the level of a machine. In art, the public accept what has been because they cannot alter it, not because they appreciate it. They swallow their classics whole and never taste them. They endure them as the inevitable, and as they cannot mar them, they mouth about them.
I think Wilde's commentary that the public craves repetition remains true even in the modern day. I mean, just look at the top 50 list of the highest grossing movies. More than 1/4 of them are superhero movies, more than half of them are sequels, and about half of those sequels are sequels of sequels. The one aspect of this commentary that is a bit outdated is the notion that the public only wants their media to entertain them. Among those 50 highest grossing films, there are a few in there that have themes that are clearly intended to challenge the audience and have them scrutinize their biases. It's worth recognizing that the world has come a long way since the 19th century, and the average person today is way more educated and receptive to new ideas than ever before. Though, with that being said, it's also undeniable that there still remains a sizable portion of the population who still holds on to this regressive view of art and what it should deliver that's no different than the peasants of the 1800s. With that very long preface out the way, we can finally talk about what you all clicked on this video to hear me discuss. The ways reactionary forces try to de-gesture the artist, or more specifically, the hatred some people feel towards villains who have sympathetic qualities. And while I could just rave at you for 20 minutes expecting you all to just agree with me, to demonstrate to you all exactly why this perspective is so harmful, I'll be showing the first section of this video titled, "Modern Villains Are Pitiful and Impotent." I wanted to show you this video in particular because of how aggressively incredulous it was. So much so that I basically felt provoked into sharing my 2 cents on this topic. Though I'd also be lying if I didn't say I couldn't pass up the opportunity to attract a larger audience by adding a dash of drama into this otherwise standard video essay. I realize this is pretty ironic given the long spiel in the beginning about how the true artist only creates to satisfy themselves, but at least I'm an honest tradesman, right?
Decently treated. They were decently treated. They were decently fed. And then they were decently shot.
Before I jump straight into this video, I want to say something positive first. I think it's obvious that Hillary is very well read. Judging from her website and the other content on her YouTube page, she seems to have a lot of experience reading actual novels. I only have experience reading visual novels, so my literature knowledge is admittedly pretty limited. With that being said, the knowledge I have accrued over the years of consuming a wide array of other media makes me confident in my assessment that Hillary really drops the ball on this topic. Let's start here in the beginning, where she introduces us to the debate surrounding the concept of evil and its importance to the villain as a character.
Naturally, a villain would be a human or human adjacent, so there ought to be more to him than just being the bad guy. Maybe we ought to examine how he came to be the bad guy, or whether or not his goals might have some merit. All of this ostensibly in the pursuit of richer characters, which is not an unworthy pursuit, but let's tackle this issue one piece at a time. All of this literary experimentation has its place, I suppose, if you do it right, which, as I said, we'll get into in a bit here. But something that we as a society have apparently forgotten is that most of the time a crucial factor in the villain's character is evil. Of course, I don't mean that all characters need to be Lucifer-esque Morningstar or even Morgoth. Although huge, ugly, powerful evil is actually a crucial aspect of fiction that is currently all but extinct. What I mean is that the clear moral judgment and acceptance that the villain character is morally bad in some major significant way is a critical part of making a villain. The idea of evil as an important aspect of a villain character has been shunned more and more by the pseudo-intellectual literary elite, who will tell you that black cloak villainy, villains who are obviously very bad, is childish and unrealistic.
Here, you can obviously see that sentiment of the public Wilde was talking about in his essay. She protests the idea that artists should experiment with the concept of villains, and dismisses people who want more realistic or morally ambiguous villains as pseudo-intellectual literary elites. I could go on about Wilde's quote on why the public hates novelty, or how the survival of art depends on its constant evolution, but you heard the quote. More importantly, I don't know if she does this on purpose or not, but this whole section of the video is written extremely deceptively. The audience might not notice this because most people don't pause and dissect every YouTube video they watch because that would be insane. Then when you hone in on what she says sentence by sentence, you'll notice that she makes multiple logical mistakes. For instance, when she raves about the pseudo-intellectual literary elites, she quickly flashes a few examples on screen. We're led to believe that each of these individuals either reject the idea that characters must possess notably evil traits to be a villain, or reject the concept of evil altogether. Of course, if this were true, I think the majority of us would agree with Hillary that these takes are at the very least unintuitive. Most of us would agree that there are actions bad enough to warrant the label of evil, and our whole conception of the villain as a character is someone who partakes in evil. Without evil doing, a character simply ceases to be a villain. Though you gotta be sharp, my friends. This is a classic straw man, a fallacy where you conflate your opponent's opinions with a more controversial one to make their argument easier to defeat. When we actually check out the writings of these so-called pseudo-intellectual literary elites, you'll notice that most of these writers don't express such a radical stance at all. Let's go through each of them, shall we? Now, I won't be reading each of these out to you in full, probably for the same reason Hillary didn't. I have to keep this video snappy for viewer retention. Though unlike her, I will be showing you the actual content of these writings so you know what these writers actually believe. In this first article titled The Banality of Evil in Fiction, the author's objective is to give advice on how to make the villain of your story more compelling. He lays out 7 pieces of advice in total, though again for the sake of brevity, you can roughly condense Dirk's arguments into 2 major ideas. The first major piece of advice is to make sure your villain is acting with purpose and not just a mindless force of nature. In other words, the goal of your villain's actions shouldn't be the action in itself. Their actions should be instrumental to some discernible gain like wealth or pleasure. This not only makes your villain more believable, but it also makes you a less lazy writer. For instance, if there was a non-evil, easier and less risky way for your villain to accomplish their goals, you should have a believable explanation for why they took the more evil route. And the second piece of advice Dirk gives is to get creative with your villain's personality and intentions. Not every villain has to be your traditional dark and brooding, power-hungry mastermind. Just like in the real world, evil comes in multiple shapes and sizes. It can take the form of an unwitting fool to an ideology, a warm and maternal authoritarian, or even something mundane like someone who works at a scam call center because the labor market in their country is flooded.
Do not read in the cards! What? Do not read in the cards!
Altogether, I personally find both of these pieces of advice pretty agreeable, though whether you find Dirk's advice useful or not is your opinion. What we can say for a fact is that nowhere in this article does Dirk argue that your villain doesn't have to be notably evil, or that evil doesn't exist. He only argues that the evil your villain exhibits can come in multiple flavors. The next article Hillary shows us is the de-demonization of evil by Ulrich Bear. In this essay, Bear discusses the concept known as the banality of evil, dubbed by the philosopher Hannah Arendt and her husband. This was a term used to capture the barbaric yet intricately bureaucratic cruelty Arendt and the rest of humanity witnessed after uncovering the horrors of the Nazi regime following World War II. While Arendt understood why we would all love to blame the atrocities on some kind of demonic miasma that wafted over Germany, turning your everyday normal citizen into a bloodthirsty monster, she also understood that it was important to keep a sober assessment of the situation. She warned that if we dismissed the evils of World War II as some kind of incomprehensible malevolent magic that took over people's bodies, it would close the door to further analysis. Her concept of the banality of evil argues that evil people aren't these creatures with depraved motives beyond our comprehension. They're you and me if we fail to keep our worst instincts in check. I'd love to keep talking about this essay because it really is fantastic, though we're only here to confirm whether this writer dismisses the idea that villains must be notably evil or that the concept of evil exists. Lucky for us, Bear clearly lays out the stance he defends in the essay's conclusion. He doesn't deny the existence of evil, but he does reject the conception of evil as this unstoppable supernatural force beyond our comprehension. This is because Bear shares Ardent's concerns that the idea of evil, as it may be applied to villains, eliminates our ability to understand evil and therefore prevent it from occurring. The last thing Hillary shows us is this book called The Myth of Evil by Philip Cole. As the title suggests, the objective of Cole's book is to challenge the concept of evil. He dismantles the concept into its fundamental ideas, then puts them back together for the purpose of getting a deeper understanding of evil, and testing whether it falls apart under scrutiny. It's also important to note that Cole himself is an atheist, so he examines the concept of evil as it could be understood within a naturalistic or secular worldview. To tell you the truth, I was originally just going to intuit Cole's arguments based on the vague description of his book posted on this website. I mean, I'd be damned if I paid $45 to read and take notes on an 8-hour-long book for one section of a free video essay I'm making for 5 people. Though, because I have so much artistic integrity, and because I happened to find a free PDF of the book online, I felt I had no excuse but to just hunker down and start reading. I thought I'd have to read the whole book before I could return back to making this review, but Cole actually delivers his argument pretty succinctly in the very first chapter. I'll do my best to deliver his argument for the myth of evil in my own words, but I encourage you to read the book yourself to make sure I'm not a liar. So let's say I made the statement, Emily hurts others because she is evil. Well, this is a complete sentence and it makes perfect sense. Evil, as an explanation, doesn't tell us much of anything about Emily's character or motives. I mean, if I presented 2 people with this statement, it's possible for them to each walk away with mutually exclusive and contradictory conceptions of Emily. One of them may think that she hurts others because she's apathetic and acts carelessly, while the other could think she hurts others as a cold and calculated decision in pursuit of her goals. Given that the purpose of a word is to deliver specific ideas to other people, we need more precise language to be more effective communicators. So, for this example, let's say that after giving her an interview, we now know that Emily hurts others because she is sadistic. She gets pleasure from causing harm. Well, with the introduction of this more precise word, it would be redundant to keep the broader word in because it adds no new information. The word sadism paints us a full picture of the motives behind Emily's actions, so we no longer need a vague term like evil muddying up the waters. The bottom line is, if we apply this analytic pressure in every use case of the word evil as an explanation, the term would effectively be erased from existence. This is because there is always an antecedent event or desired outcome underlying human behavior. When we take the time to identify these factors, we find that there are always more precise words than evil to explain people's intentions and actions. Though, what you might be asking next is, sure, evil might be a useless explanation for Emily's behavior, but doesn't the word still serve as a good description of her character? I mean, it is evil to be sadistic after all. Well, yeah, Cole would agree that evil is more appropriate as a description rather than an explanation, but he urges us to apply a bit more analytic pressure. To dissect the concept of evil even further, we must ask why Emily is sadistic. This is admittedly a pretty complicated question because there are multiple competing theoretical understandings of personality development in the field of psychology. But that doesn't mean we can throw our hands up and say sadism is the product of incomprehensible demonic forces just yet. What we do know about the trait of sadism is that it's strongly linked to antisocial personality disorder, commonly known as sociopathy. While we can't pinpoint one exact cause for a sadistic personality, because of its relation to sociopathy, there's good reason to say that sadism is the product of poor mental health. Though that brings us to the same problem we faced before. Given that we know Emily's sadistic personality is a product of her poor mental health, using the word evil would only serve to obscure this deeper context. And that, my friends, is the most important idea Cole wanted his readers to walk away with. In his own words, one attraction of the idea of evil is that it can fill that hole. The problem remains, however, that the concept of evil might itself be a black hole, a gap, and all we have is the illusion of closure. You'll notice that this is the same exact conclusion that Bear shares in his essay on the banality of evil. When we attach abstract terms like evil to society's problems, we only warp the foundation from which we can build concrete solutions. One last question you might be asking is, so this book does argue for the non-existence of evil and by extension that villains aren't inherently evil? Well, my dear viewer, I want you to remember that Cole's book is titled The Myth of Evil, not the non-existence of evil. I know this sounds pedantic, but it's made clear through reading the book that Cole chose this title for a reason. We see on the very first page of the book that he concedes that evil undeniably exists, and not much later does he explain what he means by this. While he does believe it's debatable whether evil exists in reality, he's certain that it does exist in the realm of fiction and mythology. This is because the unique powers the author possesses as the effective god of their story allows them to completely define the rules of their world. Things that would otherwise be improbable or impossible in reality can become quite natural when we add fantastical elements into the mix. For instance, if an author were to say Emily is evil because she's a demon, and demon kind are defined as inherently evil mystical entities, Emily would be evil simply by definition. So in the end, while the myth of evil may have been an appropriate example of those crazy pseudo-intellectual literary elites, if Hillary's video was about malevolent people in reality, this video is about villains who live solely in the realm of fiction, a place where Cole explicitly says evil exists. So yes, my dear viewer, none of these three writers take the radical stance that evil doesn't exist or that villains aren't evil by nature and Hillary is a liar, pants on fire. This last article Hillary shows us as a blog post by an anonymous writer who goes by the alias Inkspill. I won't be diving as far into this essay as I did with the previous entries because it's essentially just a random dude's diary entry. I was debating if I should just skip this article because I'm pretty sure it was only included in this video to punch down at an amateur and to insult the professional writers that came before by putting them in the same group. Though for the sake of avoiding the allegation that I'm omitting information to support my argument, I'll give you a quick summary of what I read. Inkspill argues that attaching moral worth to notions of good and bad is no different than attaching moral worth to notions of hot and cold. Good and bad are simply competing forces in the universe, and any normativity we derive from them is purely subjective. The conversation of moral nihilism goes beyond the scope of this video, but I feel I should quickly share why I disagree with this perspective. I would argue that moral nihilism is self-defeating because you must accept the premise you're rejecting before you can even propose such an idea as true. What I mean is, when you make the claim that it is true that conceptions of good and bad can't be universalized, you're not only implicitly saying that everyone ought to believe in this truth, but that you have good reason not to deny this truth as well. Because every truth claim we make automatically validates the goodness of truth and the reasoning we use to get there. Any truth claim that denies the goodness of truth and reason is on its face self-contradictory. To put a cap on this segment, I guess you win this one, Hillary. This guy does appear to deny the concept of evil and our traditional notion of the villain, but don't get too cocky. Only one in the 4 literary elites you showed us actually hold these nihilistic beliefs, and only 3 of them could be reasonably called elites. Now, I'm about 10 minutes into this 46-minute video essay, and you can imagine I have many more contentions with the claims and arguments made throughout it. Though I think it's best that I stop here for today, because the main objective of this video was to share my own thoughts on the subject after all. If I spent the majority of this video criticizing somebody else's point of view, I'd only be burying the lead under thicker layers of dirt, while annihilating my viewer retention in the process. And while I'm sure there's a portion of the audience out there who wouldn't mind watching a 60-minute reaction video where I smarmily debunk a chud, that will have to be another video for another time. If you want to watch the rest of the video yourself, I'll leave a link to it in the description, but honestly,
you and I and everyone with a brain knows that this is boring.
I wouldn't blame you if you felt the commentary wasn't worth your time. Let's wrap this up.
Do you really think you can shoot all those men down before they shoot you? Oh, no, Mr. Josie Wales. There is such a thing in this country called justice.
Well, Mr. Carpetbagger, we got something in this territory called the Missouri Boat Ride.
For starters, I want you to take note of the true message and intent expressed in the writings of Baron Cole. It's clear that both of these writers challenged a common notion of evil, not to induce confusion or spread moral decay, but to do the exact opposite. By forcing us to defend the concept of evil, we're tasked to identify its weak points and fortify them using logic and reason. As we develop and build upon the idea in pursuit of making it harder to attack, we'll find that at the end of the exchange we have a more complete, mature understanding of evil. Alternatively, if we're unable to defend the idea because its foundation is rife with contradictions and structural damage, it means we ought to demolish and rebuild it or make heavy renovations. Baron Cole, taking on their artistic role as the Jester, urge us to apply rigorous critical thinking rather than lazy traditional thinking, with the ultimate goal of bettering humanity. With that in mind, I also want you to take note of the quite dishonest way Hillary and other people who champion traditional conceptions of morality characterize these writers. If they aren't outright dismissed and given labels like pseudo-intellectual literary elites, their ideas are conflated with some sort of insidious nihilistic agenda. In their minds, anyone who challenges moral intuitions must be chaos junkies who only want to blur the boundaries between good and evil, villain and victim, so they can carry out their depravity with impunity. As I hope I've done while showing you all throughout this video, this slander of people who hold progressive moral views is false and overtly malicious. But I also want to point out that this shameless smear is absolutely dripping with irony. The first most obvious layer of irony comes from the fact that the majority of people who take issue with the traditional conception of evil criticize it because it's too nebulous, mystical, and broad to apply to anything in material reality, meaning they prefer a definition of evil that's more definitive and grounded, one that would actually make the boundary between good and evil more clear. Though the second layer of irony only becomes apparent after you thoroughly consider the goals and implications underlying the two sides of the argument. When we look at the worlds that these two perspectives create, It's too obvious who the true chaos junkies are. Though, just in case you don't find it too obvious, I'd like to revisit our sadistic friend Emily one last time. If you were to ask each side of the argument why Emily hurts others, they would each give you competing narratives about her character and motives. The side that argues for traditional understandings of morality is likely to say that Emily hurts others because she is evil. She harms others because she lacks the moral goodness which would deter her from causing harm. Conversely, the other side that argues for a more progressive understanding of morality would say that Emily is sadistic because of her poor mental health. She harms others because she lacks the moral wellness, which would deter her from causing harm. We discussed earlier why I think one is clearly more eloquent and precise than the other, so there's no use in rehashing the point. Though something else I haven't mentioned yet are the societal and political implications of each of these narratives. If Emily's behavior is truly the product of her evil nature, that implies that the only course of action is to incapacitate her or eliminate her. After all, the power to change Emily's ways lies solely within her, given that she was the one who ultimately chose to embrace evil over goodness. There's no way to remove the darkness that Emily willingly let into her heart, so our only option is to defeat her. We must use our overwhelming power to punish her transgressions and use the fear of receiving more punishment to scare her into compliance. On the other hand, if Emily's behavior is actually the product of her mental unwellness, that implies that our goal should be to bring her back to health. Given that Emily's moral character is now the cause of her behavior, our true enemy becomes the underlying problem influencing her actions, and not Emily herself. In this scenario, we must use research-backed therapeutic methods to help Emily develop more pro-social behaviors and attitudes for the betterment of herself and society. As you can see, these two perspectives demand completely different solutions and thus build completely different worlds. One is a world where we use violence and fear to get evildoers to comply, and the other is a world where we use science and compassion to get patients to develop healthier habits. I know which world I want to live in, but regardless of which one sounds more appealing, we know which one works. For example, when we compare nations that employ a punitive approach to crime versus those who use a more rehabilitative approach, there's a dramatic difference in the outcomes they produce. Nations like the United States with punitive deterrence-centered approaches routinely have the highest rates of reoffending, while rehabilitation-focused countries like Norway often see the lowest. And while I'm not confident enough to say that we only need rehabilitation to tackle crime, or dishonest enough to say that I'm above the desire to enact the most harsh justice on the most vile people, I do think we can fairly determine which perspective has the most true value based on which approach is more effective at reducing bad outcomes. So, given the overwhelming evidence that adopting a more progressive scientific perspective on evil will be more effective at improving the world, I can't help but question the motives of someone who would resist moving away from regressive understandings of morality. Well, it must be because they're chaos junkies who only want to blur the boundaries between good and evil, villain and victim, so they can carry out their depravity with impunity. They know as well as we do that addressing the structural or psychological issues that underlie someone's immoral behavior may have a real shot at eliminating it completely, but actually solving the problem wouldn't be any fun, would it? It's way more satisfying to watch the less affluent and mentally adjusted hopelessly writhe in a cycle where they're abducted and tortured in cages, released alone in the world with worse economic and mental conditions than they had before they were incarcerated, than inevitably getting arrested again for the same or more extreme crimes. Truly, what people who advocate for rehabilitation fail to consider is that an effective criminal justice system would deprive our good, hardworking officers from this delightful endless game of cat and mouse. I'm only half joking, of course. While I do think that malice is one of the large reasons why people hold on to a regressive moral worldview, I think the strongest motivator behind this attitude is laziness. They simply don't have any curiosity or care to challenge themselves or the world around them. And believe me, I wouldn't be so confident making such a bold, wide-sweeping claim if they didn't make it so obvious through their rhetoric. To return back to her friend Hillary once more, at some point in the video, she shares her support of the literary tradition of depicting the villain as ugly or monstrous.
When characters and people make decisions, those decisions inform their future character. Make enough bad decisions, you become a bad person. Bad has a way of metastasizing into the rest of your character. This used to be frequently depicted in children's stories with ugly villains. It conveyed to children that evil is a thing that poisons the entire person.
This is a practice you'll see most commonly employed in propaganda pieces, such as those depicting racial outsiders or enemies of war. By portraying the enemy as less human, The lazy artist can convince their lazy audience that the bad guy is fundamentally, incomprehensibly, and irreversibly evil. It's effective because it taps into some of the most ancient animalistic parts of our brain that make us feel fear and disgust when we encounter non-humans or tribal outgroups. This fight-or-flight mechanism allows us to feel less psychologically uncomfortable when we enslave, subjugate, or kill them. Leaving you to fully crack open that can of worms yourself, people like Hillary promote this tradition because it's a confirmation of the two-dimensional black and white world they've convinced themselves they live in. To wrap this video up with a nice little bow, I'll quickly lay out all the reasons why I believe people hate sympathetic villains. Firstly, when a villain is depicted as a normal human being like you and me, it challenges the childish notion that evil people are the scary others with motives beyond our comprehension. The truth is, when we actually take the time to examine the evil we observe in reality, we reliably find that negative psychological or structural conditions are at the core of it. This not only implies that evil springs from natural and man-made conditions that are within our control, it also implies that if any of us were put in traumatic enough circumstances, we can very well become a villain ourselves. This leads me to the second reason for why people hate sympathetic villains. When villains are depicted as people who need our help rather than enemies we have to defeat, it implies that there are more extensive solutions to evil than just removing troublesome people from society. We have to come to terms with the fact that this out-of-sight, out-of-mind illusion is absolutely ridiculous. Sweeping our problems under the rug doesn't do anything to meaningfully address them, and they'll only just continue to pile up. And lastly, by depicting the evil a villain might exhibit as sometimes unintentional, mundane, or even well-meaning, it demonstrates that people can be evil without even knowing. I'm sure if we all took the time to thoughtfully consider some of the simple things we do every day, we may find that we all participate in daily acts of evil without any bad intentions whatsoever. In conclusion, my dear viewers, when the artist makes their villain sympathetic, they're truly embracing their societal role as the Jester. The Jester doesn't flatter their audience by giving them a depraved monster that makes them look like an innocent angel when standing right next to them. No. The Jester's villain is a mirror from which the audience can easily identify their own moral shortcomings. People who hate sympathetic villains are simply cowards who are afraid of their own reflection. Or put more eloquently in the words of Wilde, all art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril, those who read the symbol do so at their peril. It is the spectator, and not life, that art really mirrors.